Hi friends, welcome to the See the Light Art Projects. I'm Pat Nipley, I'm your master artist, and I'm so glad you joined me for this very special lesson that we're going to do in 4 parts. This project is a watercolor project based on the great American artist Winslow Homer. And I hope you've joined me for some other art projects that you can see on our See the Light website, www.seethelightshine.com. We also have an art class that's available on there, and some of the tips and techniques you learned in art class we will be using here in art projects. So to get started, let me tell you what you're going to need just for this first lesson, lesson 1 of our special project called Peaceful Sea. You're going to need a piece of watercolor paper, and it can be student grade watercolor paper that can be purchased in a pad. At least 11 by 15, mine is a 12 by 18, so about that size, no smaller than 11 by 15. A nice sharp pencil, a good white eraser, and you'll need a set of either 8 or 16 pan watercolors, an assortment of brushes, large, medium, and small, some white paper plates, a bowl of water. You'll need some paper towel and some tissue, not too much, a little bit. And you'll want to make sure that your work surface is covered in newspaper to protect your surface and to absorb extra water that goes on the side. Okay, I know that seemed like a lot of setup for our lesson, and this is going to be a great project. When you're working in watercolor, there is a lot of setup that's required and some special cleaning. And I'm going to walk you through how to do that through all of these 4 lessons. Now, before we get started on our first part of watercolor, which we're going to do today, I want to give you some backstory on Winslow Homer. Winslow Homer was born in Boston in 1836, and he had a mother who was an amateur watercolorist, so his mom was his very first teacher. In fact, he was mostly self-taught. He didn't go to art school at all, but because he was surrounded by art and artists and lots of great supplies, and his mom was very indulging, he got to play around with materials anytime he wanted, and he developed quite a great skill in both drawing and in painting. Isn't that fun? His mom as his first teacher, I think that's fabulous. And that's where his love of art grew, from home. Now, after he was old enough to leave home, he traveled to New York because he wanted to get a job as an artist. And so he got a job as an illustrator for Harper's Weekly, and that was a very popular magazine at that time. Now, he was a commercial artist, which means he got paid for the artwork he did. But as an illustrator, he didn't just do whatever he wanted. He had to make art that would go along with either an advertisement or the cover story or an article. Now, this was before the dawn of photography, and so the magazines and books at that time relied on illustrators to really give their articles a lot of punch. They would illustrate scenes. So that's what Winslow Homer's job was. And he loved being an illustrator. Now, it didn't give him the freedom to do what he wanted, but it gave him a great opportunity to really hone his craft, his skill. Just like kind of doing homework. You might not want to do homework all the time, but it will really hone your math skills, your spelling skills, so you can do what you really want to do at a later time. Now, unfortunately, while he was at Harper's Weekly, the Civil War broke out here in the United States. That was a horrible time for our country. But he was sent as a war correspondent for Harper's Weekly. Again, so that he could come back with pictures like photographs that would come back and accompany the articles that the various journalists would write about what was happening in the Civil War. Let me show you a very famous painting by Winslow Homer. From that time, he was a war correspondent. This is called Home Sweet Home from 1863. What an irony in that title, because this poor soldier is living in a very tiny pup tent and has a small little campfire with a very meager meal of biscuits on a tin plate. This is a very realistic portrayal of a very hard time. And you know, Winslow Homer, though, was so devoted to illustrating the war accurately. He lived amongst the soldiers. He washed his clothes in the river like they did. He ate army rations. He had very tough conditions. This was very exhausting and dangerous work. But this is what he did to send back pictures so that all of those who read Harper's Weekly knew exactly what was happening on the battlefront with either the Union or the Confederate soldiers. So after the war was over in 1866, he explored a lot of different media like oil and watercolor and pastel and pen and ink sketches. And he was a master of all of those different media. So we're going to be doing a project that's mixed media today. It's watercolor primarily, but we're also going to add in some chalk pastel at the end. So whenever you use more than one, it's considered mixed media. I'm really excited to get started. Are you? Okay. So we're going to be doing Peaceful Sea. And that's because after he spent some time in New York, he decided he wanted to spend some time outside of the city. And so one summer, Homer went to Gloucester, Massachusetts. And he fell in love with that coastal town and the fishing village there and the boats and the water and the fishermen and the fishermen's families and just the whole life that was there on the coast. And that's when he fell in love with the sea. And he became known as a master painter of seascapes. Have you heard that word before, a seascape? Maybe you've heard the word landscape. Well, a landscape is a picture or a painting of a scene outside where there's land. It could have a farm in it, or trees, or a house, just about anything. But a seascape, as you can probably guess, is a picture of water. Now, it doesn't mean it has to be a literal sea. It could be an ocean or a lake or a wide river, and that's a seascape. It's where the water is the predominant subject in the painting. Homer became a master at seascapes, and he did quite a lot of them in a lot of different media: oil, watercolor, and pastel. Here's one of his seascapes from his years in Gloucester. This is called A Fair Wind. This is such fun. This is a bunch of friends and one dad sailing along in a sailboat. Can't you feel the strong wind in this picture? But the kids on the boat don't look nervous that the boat's about to tip over. They look very relaxed. They're in the capable hands of that dad on the tiller of that boat. I love this painting. It's classic Winslow Homer. He loved to capture the ordinary life of the people of that village. Okay, I bet you're anxious to get started on ours. So before we can, though, we have to establish what I call a base drawing. Now, a lot of watercolor artists will just start to paint with watercolor. But for young artists, I recommend you put in a few elements very lightly in pencil and drawing to guide you along in your composition. And so that's what we're going to do now. So to get started, we have to sketch. And the first thing we want to do, about halfway up on the paper, we're going to draw what's called our horizon line. And this doesn't need to be ruler straight. You're just going to draw a line very, very lightly. And if you're worried about your hand not being very light, slide your fingers back on the pencil so they're further back so that you can't put a lot of pressure. And so very lightly, I'm going to draw a line from one side to the other. And that's our horizon line. The horizon line is either the real or virtual line of where the sky meets the earth. Now, sometimes the horizon line is obscured when we look out by trees or a building, but it's always there. In fact, if you stood on a beach and looked out over at the ocean, where the sky meets the ocean is the horizon line. And so that's an important part of our seascape. Now, even if you don't live anywhere near a beach where you can't see where the ocean meets the sky, you still have a horizon line. Most people think it's where the sky meets the ground. You have to be careful, though, because sometimes the ground is hilly, and hills rise up out of the ground. So if there were no mountains, no hills, where is the base ground where the sky would meet it? That's the horizon line. So now what we want to do is we want to place in a light line to designate the sand. The scene we're going to paint is that we're on the edge of a sandy beach at a giant lake. And so that's our vantage point. And so we want to show just a little bit of that sandy area. So we're going to draw a diagonal line, but it's not a strong diagonal, it's just a slight diagonal. So about 2 inches up from this bottom left side of your paper, just about 2 inches up, we're going to start our line, but we want to end up about 3 inches up on the other side. So you can see that it's not straight across, it's just a slight angle. If you want, you can make a tiny little mark there if that helps you. So 2 inches up on the left side, go all the way over, about 3 inches up on this side. And this is just an estimate. And it's not going to be super straight, it's going to be kind of a little jaggedy, little bumpy up there like so. So you should have 2 lines on your paper, one that's straight across and one that is a slight diagonal and the line is kind of bumpy. Great! Now we're only going to put in a few more elements, my friends, and that's sailboats on the lake. Now one of the things that we want to do in this watercolor painting is show the audience that it's a fairly big lake. Well, the only way we can do that is to use certain tips from what we call aerial perspective. Aerial meaning in the air, in the atmosphere. Perspective is how you look at things. So I want the viewer to understand that I have several boats in here, but some are near and some are far. And so I'm going to make a large boat to the left and 2 smaller boats to the right. Those smaller boats don't mean that they're actually smaller, it just means they're further away. So on this left-hand side, you see your horizon line? We're going to make a line that crosses the horizon line. And it's going to be not quite straight up and down, but close. And the whole line is probably about 2.5 inches long. And it crosses over up above the horizon line. That's going to be the mast of our first sailboat. Underneath that, kind of like an upside down letter T, we're going to make another line, like an upside down T. Now from that mast line, we're going to make a triangle that's puffed out. That's the only way I can describe it. So instead of it being a perfectly straight line, it's going to be a puffed out line, like so. And then right above that bottom of the T that we drew, we're going to make another line. So that's going to be our sail. But we're going to chop that top off on purpose. So that top part here, of this triangle that I just drew, we're going to take our eraser and I'm going to chop it off just a little bit so that then the top is more angled like that. So then I'll connect the mast to the sail. So it's a slightly different shape. Now I want to make sure that this boat has a hull. The hull means the actual boat that you sit in. But you've probably seen boats sit in the water. They don't just float on top. I mean, it looks like they float on top, but some of the boat is submerged. So you're not going to see all of the boat. We're only going to draw the part of the boat that we see. So on this far side line, you're going to make a really strong angle, like so, like a very strong arrow on the left-hand side. From that point, very, very point, there's a diagonal line coming in to the right. You can see it almost looks like an arrow right there. From that line, I'm going to follow the same path as the one I drew earlier, parallel that, and on this end, a line comes in and it's also a little bit at an angle. From the other end of that arrowhead, I'm going to draw a line as if I'm going all the way over here, but it's going to be behind the sail, so I have to kind of skip and come back. And that's all the detail we're going to do. Now this is going to be what I'm going to call our large boat. Doesn't seem very large, but in relation to the other boats, it's large. But I'm going to assume that all these boats in real life are the same size. But one of the rules of aerial perspective is that objects appear smaller in the distance. So the 2 boats I'm going to put on this side will be smaller. Doesn't mean they're actually smaller or that they're toy boats. They're real boats. It just means they're further away. And this is a technique that artists use all the time. It's like fooling the eye. So over on this right-hand side, we're going to have 2 more boats. So the first boat, I'm going to put, I don't know, about 6 inches in from the right. And again, I'm above the horizon line, and I'm drawing a straight line down, and it's only about 1 inch high. Go over about 2 inches, and make another one, and it's even smaller. Can you see that? So this masked line is much taller than this one or this one. Now I'm going to do the same technique I did here to make the sail. Kind of puffed out triangle, puffed out triangle. Why do you think all the sails would be in the same direction? Well, generally, when you're on a lake or even at the edge of an ocean or in a bay, if the wind is blowing, the sails would all be in the same direction because it's all the same wind that's pushing the sails along. You wouldn't have it blowing in the opposite direction. That would not look right, right? Wind pushes all boats in the same direction. So that's why our sails are going here to the right and puffing out that way. Now for the hull, I'm just going to make lines that are right underneath this triangle. And we're just drawing very small, not a lot of detail. You can't really see a lot. Thin slivers. It's really thin little slivers. You don't see very much. On the other side of each of these boats, where the mast was, we need to do a double line. So another very close to it, a very thin line. You can see how light I'm drawing, my friends. Very thin line right next to it for our mast. These we're not going to chop off the tops. We're going to leave those triangles. This one is just kind of a slightly different sail. Now you'll see I have a line, a horizon line, going through each of those sails. This is why you need to have a good white eraser. So erase the little line that you don't need that's inside the sail on all three. Now another rule of atmospheric perspective, other than when objects are further away they appear smaller, is that objects that are further away or things that are further away have less detail. So I'm not going to worry about any details in these little boats. But if you wanted to add more details in this closer boat, you could. You could put a little bottom to the boat. You could put little marks as if there's a name on the boat, but you wouldn't do that further away. You can't see details really far away. Take a look at this Winslow Homer that I have here in the studio. This is called Gloucester Harbor. Do you remember I told you that Homer lived in Gloucester, Massachusetts for that one summer? This is a painting from that time. He loved to go up to Massachusetts. And you'll see this boat that's in the foreground, where you have a family out for a beautiful day. You might see the detail of the wood or the hat on this man and even the features on his face, the ribbon on this hat of the mother. But you don't really see very much detail way back here. You know there's a boat back there, but you don't see people, or on this ship here. That's because objects that are further away not only appear smaller, but they also have less detail. And that's an important thing to remember when you're doing any type of artwork that has a larger space, like a landscape or a seascape. Okay, so we know that we're not going to put in a lot of detail, but we have to fill up this entire painting. So how do you get started? Well, we want to start with our watercolor, which I know you're excited to do, but I have to give you a caution first. Because watercolor is translucent, that means you can actually see through it a little bit. All of your pencil lines will show, which is important that they stay very light. So before we start with watercolor, a very important step is to lighten up your lines. Now mine are already pretty light, but maybe you just have some trouble drawing really lightly. So this is where you're going to pause the DVD if you need to and do some erasing. And that doesn't mean you erase it away, it just means you lightly go over with your eraser so that those lines are really, really light. You need to be able to see them, but you don't want anyone else to. So come back when you've done your lightening. Okay, so now we're ready to start with our watercolor wash. All of the things that we've drawn, our little elements for our peaceful sea, are drawn in but nice and light. And so for a wash, we want to get ready with some paper plates. The largest brush you have, it can either be a flat soft brush or it can be a round soft brush, but the largest one you have. a pan of watercolors, either 8 or 16, and some water. Now the first thing we're going to do, friends, is make a puddle on the plate. And that should be about the size of a large cookie. Yeah, that looks about right. But now we have to get some color in that puddle. And so we have to do what's called loading the brush. So let me show you how to do that. You're going to take your brush and you're going to dip it in some water. And you're going to go right to your pan. But you're going to place your brush on its side. And you're going to roll it so it can pull up some of that pigment. Friends, you never take a brush and stab it down into your pans. You always treat your brushes with the utmost care, and then they'll last a long time. So I'm loading my brush by rolling it on its side, and I can see that that pigment is getting picked up by those super fine bristles. Now I'm going to go back into my puddle and swish it around. Now that's a very light wash because the more water, the lighter the watercolor paint. So I'm actually going to do this step a few times. You need to load your brush several times. Roll it around in your blue. I think I want one more time. Load my brush by rolling it, rolling it, rolling it. Being gentle as I do it. Great. Now this wash is actually going to be used for both the sky and the lake. It's going to be used as the base for our lake. It's not going to stay the way we start, so I don't want you to get frustrated. It's just going to be start with one layer and then we're going to add in. So take the largest brush you have, and the way it works with the wash, my friends, is you want to work quickly. And you're going to work from side to side. Now this is why it's important to have the newspaper underneath so that it captures all the watercolor that's going to go over, because you're going to go past the edge of the paper and back and forth, and so it's going to make a mess. So we're going to dip our brush into this wash, and you can see how it's a nice even color, and we're going to work fairly quickly over the entire piece of paper down to the sand line. Now what you do want to do, friends, is avoid the sails of the sailboat. So I'm working quickly, but I'm going around the sails of the sailboat. Now you see how my paper is curling up? This happens because of the moisture on the paper. You've probably seen that when the daily newspaper gets wet, it curls up. So I'm going to give you a tip for how you deal with that. I would recommend you have some masking tape, and you don't even have to do all of it. You can just do it in pieces. But right on the newspaper, just take a tiny little bit of that edge, tiny little bit of the edge of the painting, and you're going to masking tape it down right to the newspaper, because you have to leave this where it's sitting for a while after you're finished so it can dry. So make sure it's somewhere where you're not going to touch it for a while. Now, because I know I'm going to be painting this whole thing, I'm going to continue to put little bits of tape around to keep it nice and still, right on this newsprint. Now a lot of artists will do watercolor and tape the entire thing, or they do what's called where they stretch their watercolor paper by pre-wetting it. We're not going to do that, but I wanted you to know. Okay, so now that I have my masking tape pieces down, it should stay put for me and stay flat. Now it still might bubble up a little as it gets moisture in there. It's perfectly normal, okay? So now I'm going to go back and I avoid the sails, right? Avoid the sails. And you see I went into this boat. The good thing is I have tissue handy. Remember I said keep tissue handy. And I'm going to blot that up. Now I'm going down to the sand line. That's that slight diagonal line we drew. Just a slight diagonal line. And whenever the color is just one solid color of a watercolor, that's called a wash. So that's what I'm doing down the bottom here. This is just the base color for our lake. But I don't want it to be one solid color in the sky, because if you're looking straight up at the sky, it can usually be a solid color. But when you're looking down towards the horizon line, it's more of a very gradual change. And so while this is still wet, what I'm going to do is dip into my puddle, but then I'm going to go to my pan and dip there. So it's going to be much more intense color. I'm going to start at the top. See that intense color? Isn't that great? Then I'm going to go back to my puddle, which is going to be lighter, and I'm going to go just below where I just was, back and forth, to make it blend. Now I'm not going back to the pan again. I'm going to continue to go back to the puddle. And see how I'm going back and forth. Now I still have pigment in there, and that's what helps get that gradual wash, right? Back and forth, back and forth. Now you see how a little bit of the bristle or a little bit of the hair came off in the painting? Use your brush to pick it up and get rid of it. That sometimes happens with brushes. The hairs come out. That's okay. So I'm going to keep doing this. After I dipped into the pan for the very top, that was only the one time, and then the rest of the time I'm just going back to the puddle. And the same thing, I'm going to avoid the sails. So now I have, friends, what's called a graded wash. It starts off dark and gets light, as opposed to a flat wash that is all one hue. Now, this is the fun part. While it's still wet, grab your tissues, wad it up into a ball, hold it in one hand, and now we're going to go up into the sky and we're going to blot out the clouds. So, I'm going to actually press down, and you can see I'm picking up some of that blue. So you're just going to press and make kind of a long sausage kind of shape. And then I'm going to do another one over here. Not exactly the same size or shape, but you can see I'm pulling up the color. One of the great things about watercolor is you can fix a lot of different things because it's so liquid and it's got water as its base. So here I have one cloud formation that's like a little bit taller than its other one here. And by pressing down, I'm able to pick up some of that blue. How about that? Wasn't that a quick cloud? Now we're not finished with those clouds. We're going to be adding in some more white with the chalk pastel at the end. And there are ways to mask out for clouds. You can actually take some rubber cement, and you can use rubber cement as a mask. You can make an area the size of what you want, paint right over it, around it, and then peel the rubber cement when you're done, and it leaves you back with white or whatever your base color of your paper is. Awesome. Now that's all we can do with our painting today, my friends, because one of the things about watercolor is it's made of water. And so whenever wet is near wet, maybe you've seen this happen, it runs and bleeds. And so you don't want to paint something wet in an area that's right next to an area that is still wet, because then it all will run together and it could be a mess. Now sometimes that's a great technique, and you can get some really interesting effects when you work wet in wet. But we don't want to do that for our peaceful sea. So we have to stop and wait until it dries, and then we'll get together next time and we'll work on the sandy beach part. This is one of the fun things about watercolor, but it can be a little frustrating. So I'm hoping that you're going to stay patient throughout this project so that you can learn some really fun techniques that you can do. And don't get frazzled. Watercolor is tricky to work with. I know you're going to do a great job because you're going to follow along step by step so that we can complete a really great project. Friends, before we finish up, we have to make sure we always clean our brushes. So make sure you wash your brush in as clean water as you can. If you have a sink nearby, that's even better. And what you're going to do is you're going to run it under the sink, under the water, and always test on a paper towel to make sure it dries clear. So just brush it along, and if there's any color still in it, continue to rinse until it's totally clear on the paper towel. Grab it and pull it to a point with your fingers, and that's the way you want to store your brush, nice and flat. You know, I'm looking at this water, and I know we're not finished yet, but I'm excited to see what it's going to look like when we're all done. This is just the first step. And when I think about water, it makes me think of all the verses in Scripture that talk about water. You know, there's quite a lot of them. A lot of them in the Psalms. Psalms, of course, one of my favorite books. And Psalms has a lot of passages about water that actually teach us a lot about God. Did you know that? Like this one says, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. For he founded it on the seas and established it on the waters." That's from Psalm 24, the first two verses. See, God created everything in the world, including the water. He's the one who, on that first week of creation, separated the water from the land. And he knew he was going to fill it with all kinds of teeming creatures, and that water was going to be the thing that sustained life for everything that lived on the planet, plants and people and animals. And so it's really an incredible thing, water is. And water can bring such comfort and peace. I don't know about you, but I love to sit in the mountains looking out at a lake and just hear the water. It's so peaceful, and it reminds me of the peace that comes from God. Of course, there's lots of other images of water too, stormy seas, which we'll see later in one of the other lessons, and that can remind me of God's power too. So I'm excited to work on this project with you called Peaceful Sea. So let your painting stay nice and flat and dry for a while before you join me for lesson 2 of our Winslow Homer inspired painting, Peaceful Sea.